I think it's gonna. We'll be starting in about 10 minutes. So let's just get the link out for people. So yes, busy week. Wasn't here last week. Tonight we're going to have a natter with some of the Freudian Spaceship people who want to turn up and can. We're just going to look at some texts that we like, that we love, that we want to read. Just send everyone in the group the link. So yes, last week we weren't here because it was busy in terms of family. My dad's not well; he's quite elderly, and he was in hospital. Needed to take a break. And this week, oh, that's quite nice. Quite like that. This week, we're going to start a little bit later, and we're going to begin to start a little bit later, 8 o'clock. Rather than 7, because Free University Brighton is back into its new term, and there are some other courses. We have a new course starting next week, an introduction to decolonial political ecology, and that's going on every fortnight, and that's going on from 6 to 8 p.m. That's a Free University Brighton course, so if you're interested in that, obviously join in River and stuff. Anyway, let me just check that we're all okay. Just not that. Okay, we seem to be okay on Twitch. YouTube. Okay, that all seems good. And we are also on Facebook. If you're around and you want to do that. What have we been up to? Well, it's been, let me exit this. It's been a very busy week, but we are beginning to get settled back into the rhythm of everyday life. Hey, Bob, how are you?
That's the same as I was when you left me about 5 minutes ago. Yes, I'm very good. Thank you. I'm very good. Quite relaxed.
I have my little overlay on. I was looking today at ways of if we're going to carry on doing writing, we're going to continue to pursue that thing. I was trying to look at ways of doing collaborative magazine or zine layups, but it's not immediately obvious how to do that. But I was thinking about maybe pushing ourselves into the idea of making a publication or something might enable the writing practice to coalesce. I don't know. What would is that worth doing, do you reckon?
I think there's a lot to be said about moving away from an editorial practice, because so much baggage comes with that. You have the editorial piece, you have the opinion piece, you have and it's just a very stale way of doing it that reminds me a little bit, particularly sort of, politically and academically, it reminds me a little bit of the panel platform, So
I think that's more why I was thinking of a zine-y kind of situation. You know what I mean?
But I'm still that that thing about if you have 10 people writing a leaflet, or it's a bit like 10 people describing an elephant wearing a blindfold. So
that's not a bad thing. I don't know. You think?
I think maybe there's just another way of thinking about it, of like moving away from this idea of house styles or, you know,
Oh,
things that
sure.
have to look consistent. Is like, you know, it's okay for people to have their own pages and for them to put stuff in their own pages. It doesn't have to be uniform in any sort of way. The media has made things
Right.
uniform in a
Yeah.
way that I don't think needs to happen.
Yeah,
So
no,
I'd go beyond uniformity, really, and look at the idea of substance over style.
let me just get my glasses.
Have I got them?
What do they look like from your end?
Looks like this.
Oh, right, okay.
Oh, look, here you are in both places. Colourful. Molly.
Right, just to remind you, we don't start for another 5 minutes or so, but we're just logging on streaming, making sure things are working before we get going. And tonight we're going to, as I mentioned, have a couple of texts. So we're going to do a little bit of reading. And the idea, why did I want to do that? I wanted to look at text because I thought if we were to read a bit of stuff that we like, it helps kind of focus on, I don't know, I suppose that's that sense of like doing it yourself. You need to sort of think about what it is you like with what the other people do. That was my sort of thought. And partly because it's nice to enjoy that reading out loud. It was interesting you were talking about kids reading in school today and reading out loud, group reading. I think that can be a really interesting thing sometimes. Right, God, I have notes all over my desk that I've kind of tidied up, but now I still have these odd little bits still sitting here I need to sort out. All right.
I think sometimes reading a text that has really kind of spoken to you is, you know, it makes it active. It makes the text a kind of active agent in your life, sort of thing. And if text becomes active and has some sort of agency, then the idea of writing can seem a little bit closer.
Yeah, that's a nicer way of putting it then. But that's a similar kind of thing to what I'm thinking. Is this relationship of agency towards text, particularly in terms of thinking, is quite a complicated one to develop. What have I got? Oh yes, I've so yeah, I think that's the idea. I've got something that actually when I picked it up and I was looking around at the weekend thinking about what text I actually really wanted. I was looking for a while at Lucy Irigary's Elemental Passions because that was one of my early texts. Can you hear me okay? Yes,
I can, yeah. I'm just sorry, I'll put myself on mute because I'm sucking on my vape. Anyway, Irigary.
Yeah, I was looking at Lucy Irigary's Elemental Passions. It was a text I was really, really into when I was doing my master's thesis.
Is that the one after Marine Lover?
I think it might be before in terms of her publication history, but it was. I read it before Marine Lover, so I read Marine Lover afterwards. But in the end, I went back to something that actually is. I don't know if you can see the date. I wonder if you can see the date there.
No, I can't actually. Oh, wait a minute. Go on.
Let's get
Bit closer. No, I can't really. February 93.
Yeah, there we go. February 93. And I must admit, I was a bit surprised when I noticed that. I was thinking, Jesus Christ, was it that long ago that I read this damn thing?
So you would have been in your second year of your undergraduate then?
Yeah. And this is a book that this my text is I'll mention it a little bit when we start. Okay, so it's just coming up for 8.
Can you give people another couple of minutes?
I will give people another couple of minutes. Helen and John are here. I'll bring you in a moment. If you can hear me, that's great. We'll start at 8. I'll put a little timer on. In fact, let's do my little timer. Oh no, it's 8 o'clock now. Okay, let's bring people in, and we can sort of give other people, when they come in, their little moments. How are you? How are you all? How are you, John? How are you, Helen? Are you both good?
Find that good? Still homeless.
Your long saga of strange trying to move houses is continued.
14 weeks now.
Oh my God. Okay, that is a long time, isn't it? Where are you now? Where are you this week?
Quarter of a year. I'm in the same. It's third week in a row in the same place. My brother-in-law's, but.
Well, that's a little bit more settled than you have been, isn't it? That's a little bit more settled.
But it's an hour and 25 minutes away from my new house, which I went to today just to see if anybody was working on it, but nobody was. But yeah.
How are you, Helen? All good?
Yeah, my audio's a bit crackly, but apart from that, I'm okay. How are you?
Tired, but getting there. Getting there, I think, is a good phrase at the moment. How are you, Rob?
Yeah, I'm okay, thank you. Yeah, pretty good. Looking forward to hearing what people have chosen and to read and things like that.
Yes, I was just talking with Morrigan just before we started. So yes, since we started, this is the Freudian Spaceship conversation group. We are now going to be meeting at 8 p.m. Because, as I mentioned a little while ago, Free University Brighton has begun its new term, and there is a course, Introduction to Decolonial Political Ecology, that is beginning next Monday from 6 o'clock to 8 o'clock every fortnight. And so I didn't really want to clash with them. And I wanted to make sure people could have a look at that course if they wanted to, and we don't want to necessarily clash. It's not good, is it? So we're just shifting to 8 and probably fortnightly ourselves in between the things. And I may do a little bit of gaming or something, or a little bit of being online, after their sessions. But possibly I'm just going to, I might try and get along to the introduction to decolonial political ecology myself. It looks like very interesting stuff, similar to some of the themes that we were talking about in terms of Freudian Spaceship, in terms of like Fanon and schizoanalysis and decolonization. But more, this sounds terrible, and I don't mean it sounds terrible, but more academic, more like disciplinary. It's going to be more of an introduction to that kind of disciplinary discourse around political ecology, I believe, which has quite a strong tension between a kind of political economy and a political ecology. I think there's quite often interesting discussions because a lot of the decolonial political ecology is trying to build theories that don't just use Marxism, for example, that use other things as well, that have other kind of, which is the kind of stuff we were looking at when we were looking at Fanon and schizoanalysis, kind of combination of anti-colonial and decolonial thought with some of the other stuff that is often lumped under the heading of critical theory or radical philosophy or something along those lines. So yes, that course, Introduction to Decolonial Political Ecology, begins Free University Brighton next Monday, 6 p.m. Every fortnight until December. And there'll be a second part of that course next spring, apparently. And that's being taught online because I know Felix is in Brighton, but someone else, one of the other tutors, is in the Lebanon. So that's the other thing. That's the other reason it'll be taught online, I believe, if I remember rightly. How are you, James?
Well, thanks, mate.
Have you had a good week? Good couple of weeks?
Yeah, not too bad, thanks. I hope everything's all right with you, and you had a nice. You were taking your dad to hospital and that kind of, or seeing him in hospital, that kind of thing.
Yes, it was a hectic week like usual. Unfortunately, he's a slightly frail, elderly gentleman, and yes, he had a lot of pain and had to go to hospital, and then came out and he was in for 3 or 4 days, and you end up spending a lot of time sitting around in the NHS
Yeah.
stressful space, even if it's a really relatively boring, stressful space. It's a kind of strange thing being in hospitals.
Yeah.
I have quite a lot of experience with it. So the idea tonight was to begin to bring some text, and I was mentioning just kind of the reasoning behind this, or the thought behind this, was obviously part of the idea here was that we were trying to work towards a relationship to writing, being able to maybe write something around the themes of the conversations we've been having. But in the end, a lot of that is not so much, responding to an academic discourse with a kind of answer to a general question, which is what often is the structure of an academic course. You have a certain amount of material. You're meant to then check whether you've read, listened, understood that material by responding to a question with an essay, and this is the traditional university way of doing something. But here I'm more interested in, and I think Morrigan mentioned the word agency in relationship to text. So that's how I perceive our kind of project. And so the idea of bringing some text that we love or that we like was that there's a kind of relationship of something like agency, something like our subjectivity to those texts. If we like them, there must be something about us that is in some sense relating positively to that text. And just looking at that might begin to enable us to think about the kind of things that we would like to write ourselves, if we wanted to write something. So that was the idea. So, I mean, I've brought something that I will start with. And the reason I'm going to do that is because it's going to give people a little bit of chance to just settle in and relax. Think of this like story time. Yes, so welcome everybody, welcome to story time, and we can all just sort of relax and listen a little bit, and then, as it comes around, if you brought your own text, then you can read your own text, and and hopefully you'll have settled into the space by the time you get to do that, so that you're not completely off. This will probably be about 10 minutes. It's from a book called After Virtue, a study in moral theory. And for anyone who knows me, they may be a little bit surprised that I'm going to read something from moral philosophy, because that's not usually what most people would associate me with, whether it be in FUB or anywhere else, because I don't really do moral philosophy. And one of the reasons I don't really do moral philosophy is because of this book, After Virtue, which I read, and I was showing this to Morrigan earlier. I read this. I'm going to try and put it up there. There we go. February 1993. So this was the second year of my undergraduate studies. So I'd come out of prison in 1991, and I'd gone to university in 1992. And this was the second year of my university career. So I was literally, and I had no A-levels or anything like that. I hadn't been in school since I was 16. So this was one of the books that I read that really got me into philosophy and made me sort of really, really love some of the things about philosophy. And the other thing that's interesting about this text is it's really boring. Okay, that's it. So, and I'll try not to make it more boring than it is, but it's really boring. It's the kind of things I love now, like if anyone who reads Deleuze and Guattari, or anyone who reads William Burroughs, or any of these kind of things that I have been sort of bringing along, or even Frantz Fanon, whose texts are absolutely beautiful and stunning and have all this passion in them. One of the things I love about texts is texts that are very alive, that have this kind of very irreverent relationship to what they're trying to do. They're not calm, they're not neutral, they're not considered, and they're not particularly academic quite often. I think we could fairly easily say that is the case with both Fanon and Deleuze and Guattari. They're not what you would think of as traditional academic texts. This is much more of a traditional academic text in a way. It's an extremely famous book, After Virtue. It reintroduces into moral theory what's sometimes now called virtue ethics. And before Alistair MacIntyre's text, before this particular text, this notion of virtue ethics, which is kind of Aristotle, was much less dominant inside moral theory. And so what you had inside moral theory was basically John Stuart Mill and utilitarianism, and Immanuel Kant and deontologism. Deontological just means duty, moral duty. So you had these kind of two splits, and you didn't really have such a big issue with regard to virtue ethics. And also this particular text introduced me to the concept of genealogy. which I later sort of developed through Nietzsche and introduced me to Nietzsche. This was my first kind of encounter with Nietzsche in a way. That's a long, strange story. Anyway, I'm going to read chapter 1. It's only 5 pages. It's called A Disquieting Suggestion. This is Alistair McIntyre, After Virtue.
Hold on. Have you got
Yep.
some music on in the
Oh,
background?
yes, let me turn the music off. You're quite right. I have got some background music just as we were starting. Thank you for noticing that. So, yes. So, background music off. This is Alistair McIntyre, After Virtue, Chapter 1, A Disquieting Suggestion. Imagine that the natural sciences were to suffer the effects of a catastrophe. A series of environmental disasters are blamed by the general public on the scientists. Widespread riots occur. Laboratories are burnt down. Physicists are lynched. Books and instruments are destroyed. Finally, a know-nothing political movement takes power and successfully abolishes science teaching in schools and universities, imprisoning and executing the remaining scientists. Later still, there is a reaction against this destructive movement, and enlightened people seek to revive science, although they have largely forgotten what it was. But all that they possess are fragments, a knowledge of experiments, detached from any knowledge of the theoretical context which gave them significance. Parts of theories unrelated either to the other bits and pieces of theory which they possess or to experiment. Instruments whose use has been forgotten. Half chapters from books, single pages from articles, not always fully legible because torn and charred. Nonetheless, all these fragments are re-embodied in a set of practices which go under the revived names of physics, chemistry, and biology. Adults argue with each other about the respective merits of relativity theory, evolutionary theory, and phlogiston theory, although they possess only a very partial knowledge of each. Children learn by heart the surviving portions of the periodic table and recite as incantations some of the theorems of Euclid. Nobody, or almost nobody, realizes that what they are doing is not natural science in any proper sense at all. For everything that they say and do conforms to certain canons of consistency and coherence, and those contexts which would be needed to make sense of what they are doing have been lost, perhaps irretrievably. In such a culture, men would use expressions such as neutrino, mass, specific gravity, atomic weight, in systematic and often interrelated ways which would resemble in lesser or greater degrees the ways in which such expressions had been used in earlier times before scientific knowledge had been so largely lost. But many of the beliefs presupposed by the use of these expressions would have been lost, and there would appear to be an element of arbitrariness and even of choice in their application, which would appear very surprising to us. What would appear to be rival and competing premises for which no further argument could be given would abound. Subjectivist theories of science would appear and would be criticized by those who held that the notion of truth embodied in what they took to be science was incompatible with subjectivism. This imaginary possible world is very like one that some science fiction writers have constructed. We may describe it as a world in which the language of natural science, or parts of it at least, continues to be used, but is in a grave state of disorder. We may notice that if in this imaginary world analytical philosophy were to flourish, it would never reveal the fact of this disorder. For the techniques of analytical philosophy are essentially descriptive, and descriptive of the language of the present at that. The analytical philosopher would be able to elucidate the conceptual structures of what was taken to be scientific thinking and discourse in the imaginary world in precisely the way that he elucidates the conceptual structures of natural science as it is. Nor again would phenomenology or existentialism be able to discern anything wrong, or the structures of intentionality would be what they are now. The task of supplying an epistemological basis for these false simulacra of natural science would not differ in phenomenological terms from the task as it is presently envisaged. A Husserl or a Merleau-Ponty would be as deceived as a Strawson or a Quine. What is the point of constructing this imaginary world inhabited by fictitious pseudoscientists and real, genuine philosophy? The hypothesis which I wish to advance is that in the actual world which we inhabit, the language of morality is in the same state of grave disorder as the language of natural science in the imaginary world which I just described. What we possess, if this view is true, are the fragments of a conceptual scheme, parts which now lack those contexts from which their significance derived. We possess, indeed, simulacra of morality. We continue to use many of the key expressions, but we have very largely, if not entirely, lost our comprehension, both theoretical and practical, of morality. But how could this be so? The impulse to reject the whole suggestion out of hand will certainly be very strong. Our capacity to use moral language, to be guided by moral reasoning, to define our transactions with others in moral terms is so central to our view of ourselves that even to envisage the possibility of our radical incapacity in these respects is to ask for a shift in our view of what we are and do, which is going to be difficult to achieve. But we do already know two things about the hypothesis which are initially important for us if we are to achieve such a shift in viewpoint. One is that philosophical analysis will not help us. In the real world, the dominant philosophies of the present, analytical or phenomenological, will be as powerless to detect the disorders of moral thought and practice as they were impotent before the disorders of science in the imaginary world. Yet the powerlessness of this kind of philosophy does not leave us quite resourceless. For a prerequisite, that's a terrible word, for a prerequisite for understanding the present disordered state of the imaginary world was to understand its history, a history that had to be written in three distinct stages. The first stage was that in which the natural sciences flourished, the second, that in which they suffered catastrophe, and the third, that in which they were restored in damaged and disordered form. Notice that this history, being one of damage, being one of decline and fall, is informed by standards. It is not an evaluatively neutral chronicle. The form of the narrative, the division into stages, presuppose standards of achievement and failure, of order and disorder. It is what Hegel called philosophical history, and what Collingwood took all successful historical writing to be. That if we are to look for resources to investigate the hypothesis about morality, which I have suggested, however bizarre and improbable it may appear to you now, we shall have to ask whether we can find in the type of philosophy and history propounded by writers such as Hegel and Collingwood, very different from each other as they are, of course, resources which we cannot find in analytical or phenomenological philosophy. But this suggestion immediately brings to mind a crucial difficulty for my hypothesis. For one objection to the view of the imaginary world which I constructed, let alone to my view of the real world, is that the inhabitants of the imaginary world reached a point where they no longer realized the nature of the catastrophe which they had suffered. Yet surely an event of such striking world historical dimensions could not have been lost from view, so that it was both erased from memory and unrecoverable from historical records. And surely what holds of the fictitious world holds even more strongly of our own real world. If a catastrophe sufficient to throw the language and practice of morality into grave disorder had occurred, surely we should all know about it. It would indeed be one of the central facts of our history. Yet our history lies open to view, so it will be said, and no record of any such catastrophe survives. So my hypothesis must simply be abandoned. To this I must at the very least concede that it will have to be expanded. Yet unfortunately at the outset expanded in such a way as to render it, if possible, initially even less credible than before, for the catastrophe will have to have been of such a kind that it was not and has not been, except perhaps by a very few, recognized as a catastrophe. We shall have to look not for a few brief striking events whose character is incontestably clear, but for a much longer, more complex and less easily identified process, and probably one which by its very nature is open to rival interpretation. Yet the initial implausibility of this part of the hypothesis may perhaps be slightly lessened by another suggestion. History, by now, in our culture, means academic history. And academic history is less than 2 centuries old. Suppose it were the case that the catastrophe of which my hypothesis speaks had occurred before or largely before the founding of academic history, so that the moral and other evaluative presuppositions of academic history derived from the forms of the disorder which it brought about. Suppose, that is, that the standpoint of academic history is such that from its value-neutral viewpoint, moral disorder must remain largely invisible, or that the historian, and what is true of the historian is characteristically true also of the social scientist, will be allowed to perceive by the canons and categories of his discipline will be one morality succeeding another: 17th century Puritanism, 18th century hedonism, and Victorian work ethic, and so on. But the very language of order and disorder will not be available to him. If this were to be so, it would at least explain why what I take to be the real world and its fate has remained unrecognized by the academic curriculum. For the forms of the academic curriculum would turn out to be among the symptoms of the disaster, whose occurrence the curriculum does not acknowledge. Most academic history and sociology, the history of a Namier or a Hofstadter and the sociology of a Merton or a Lipset, are after all as far away from the historical standpoint of Hegel and Collingwood as most academic philosophy is from their philosophical perspective. It may seem to many readers that as I have elaborated my initial hypothesis, I have step by step deprived myself of very nearly all possible argumentative allies. But is not just this required by the hypothesis itself? For if the hypothesis is true, it will necessarily appear implausible, since one way of stating part of the hypothesis is precisely to assert that we are in a condition which almost nobody recognizes and which perhaps nobody at all can recognize fully. If my hypothesis appeared initially plausible, it would certainly be false. And at least if even to entertain this hypothesis puts me into an antagonistic stance, it is a very different antagonistic stance from that of, for example, modern radicalism. For the modern radical is as confident in the moral expression of his stances and consequently in the assertive uses of the rhetoric of morality as any conservative has ever been. Whatever else he denounces in our culture, he is certain that it still possesses the moral resources which he requires in order to denounce it. Everything else may be, in his eyes, in disorder, but the language of morality is in order, just as it is. That he too may be being betrayed by the very language he uses is not a thought available to him. It is the aim of this book to make that thought available to radicals, liberals, and conservatives alike. I cannot, however, expect to make it palatable, for if it is true, we are all already in a state so disastrous that there are no large remedies for it. Do not, however, suppose that the conclusion to be drawn will turn out to be one of despair. Angst is an intermittently fashionable emotion, and the misreading of some existentialist texts has turned despair itself into a kind of psychological nostrum. But if we are indeed in as bad a state as I take us to be, pessimism too will turn out to be one more cultural luxury that we shall have to dispense with in order to survive in these hard times. I cannot, of course, deny, indeed my thesis entails, that the language and the appearances of morality persist, even though the integral substance of morality has to a large degree been fragmented and then in part destroyed. Because of this, there is no inconsistency in my speaking, as I shall shortly do, of contemporary moral attitudes and arguments. I merely pay to the present the courtesy of using its own vocabulary to speak of it. I hope that wasn't too long for you. Okay, so that's Alistair McIntyre and this text called After Virtue. And let me just 1 second, I've got a little. Okay. So yeah, Alistair McIntyre, this text After Virtue, in which he basically claims that there's a radical genealogical break, much in the same way that Nietzsche claims that good and bad are turned into good and evil on the genealogy of morals. And in fact, it turns out that McIntyre later in the text uses Nietzsche as part of his inspiration for this, although he also finds Nietzsche to be deeply, deeply problematic. But yeah, he has this kind of interesting thesis. The first time I ever encountered this kind of account of philosophy trying to say something like, there's a framework of thinking that you live in that might be so hidden from you, the assumptions built into it so hidden from you that you can't even notice them. And so it kind of pointed to this really strange kind of trap that you can get into when reasoning, that, you know, that you can always be caught by your own assumptions, particularly the ones that you don't even think of as being assumptions, that you think of as kind of just being the facts of the world. And I think it must have, well, I know it did. I know it made me think, wow, there's something really interesting in philosophy here, even though, as you probably got from the text, it's not a terribly inspiring text. It's just presenting this kind of thought experiment in a quite dry academic way. But it was this kind of moment of break that philosophy offered there, and the text offered, that was in itself kind of, telling you how caught up you were inside the language, that I think was really interesting for me, and actually part of the way in which, part of my movement away from moral theory myself. So that was me. Any questions on that? Anyone want to comment on that before we do anything else? Any thoughts about that? Any? Go on, John.
Yeah, how did you feel that you moved away from the language?
How do you feel I moved away from the language? Doesn't he seem like a very Cambridge academic? He references all these nice academics. He has this very calm kind of language. It's very, there's almost no, there's no anger anywhere in it. I think that's what I found when I encountered academic philosophy. There was no anger anywhere in it. It was quite calm and peaceful for a while, until I realized that was probably a delusion. So, John, what did you? Are you muted?
Right. Yeah. As I'll go on to explain it, if I get to do my talking, is I need to sort of, it's all expanding way out that, and then I need to have a single thought, and then in order to understand it. And so, as I got from that, it's like the fish in the water story, where fish don't understand water because that's their reality, water. So you can't really talk about land to fish if they could understand, because their reality is water. So they don't have water, they just have being. And that's what from that. Once I got that, I could then concentrate on the sort of bits on the outside. And that's the problem I find with philosophy. I've got to find the inner track first.
Sorry, muted. My thing just came up with a little notice telling me I was muted. Then, yeah, I think that fish story is right. That kind of analogy is kind of, it's that sense of how deep does the context go? How much is the conceptual scheme is the phrase used. How much is your conceptual scheme, hidden from you? Can you see through your own glass? Can you see the glasses that you're looking through? Those kind of things. Anyone else? Maybe we can come back to this later if you want, and don't feel like it's necessary, but otherwise we're going to move to other texts. Morrigan, you've got a kind of troubled look on your face. Do you have a sort of half a thought there?
That's right. I have half a thought. So
give us half a thought. Go on. We don't need fully formed thoughts here.
Well, this idea of some great catastrophe, some great unhidden but not hidden catastrophe, it seems both universal and also very personal. So something that at some point has been personally collective or collectively personalized. And I think that has some kind of resonance with today. But at the same time, it does seem sort of quite dry and quite sort of like, oh my God, what on earth happened in the 20th century? It does have those sort of like echoes of that as well, which do actually seem to be a little simplistic and a little bit sort of like, if only we'd have just stuck with the cant. It does seem to have that kind of sort of sense for me.
I think that's fair enough. I think, I would take McIntyre was a radical involved in the Marxist movement, but he was also a Catholic and an existentialist. Strange mixture of a bunch of stuff there, you know what I mean? And so I think this is part of a kind of dynamic of him, in a sense, from a Marxist perspective, this would be him becoming conservative, becoming kind of traditionalist, or becoming like, uncertain about the clarity of the Marxist message and beginning to move away from this. And that's probably sort of the background to the text. MacIntyre was very, very heavily involved in sort of existentialist and Marxist stuff in the 50s and 60s, and was one of the transmission belts for phenomenology and existentialism coming into Britain and into the English language in some ways. And so, yeah, there is definitely an element of conservatism in that. And that's also, in a sense, when I was first involved in philosophy, I was kind of fascinated by intelligent conservatives. For a while, I was really interested in reading Roger Scruton, even though I disagreed with him terribly, because he's a very intelligent conservative. And so MacIntyre is a kind of, not really a conservative, but he was definitely moving towards a kind of, way of trying to reaffirm his Catholicism and his belief in virtue rather than something else. And actually, morally, I think it's one of the most interesting arguments in moral philosophy in the late 20th century. Rob, did you have any thoughts there?
I suppose it's just like another language to me. It's like it's because I don't really know anything about moral philosophy, and I suppose because the philosophy I've read is more like Deleuze and Guattari, and I suppose I guess they are sort of saying maybe that an ethics would be more appropriate than a morality. So I don't know. I have many half thoughts as well, or quarter thoughts, not even half thoughts. But yeah, it's another language to me, and I suppose, like you said, the interesting part of it is to think about how deep it goes, and how perhaps we don't even know how deep it goes, and it might shape us. Yeah, that is an interesting sort of that is a really interesting thing to think about, regardless of whether you agree with him or not, I suppose.
John slipped away for a little while. I'm sure he'll be back. Yeah, right. So that kind of break in the catastrophe that he's talking about, I think I would argue now that there's an analogy that we can make to this argument with regard to the idea of work and labour. What it is and what the role of work is, that has been transformed through capitalism in such a way, in a catastrophic way, in a sense, so that we no longer know what work would be that wasn't alienated work. We're now in a position where the very concept of work itself is a kind of, to have to go to work equals to have to be alienated. And yet that's plainly, there's something strange about that, and people struggle because they want to get job fulfillment and all this kind of stuff, and so they're constantly working on a way of how to make work non-alienating, quite reasonably, and yet inside a framework in which the very structure of what we mean by work is kind of inherently alienating. And this, I think, there's an analogy that we could make, to do with the idea of a kind of catastrophe with regard to that's sort of similar to what MacIntyre is making there with regard to morality. James, did you have any particular thoughts you wanted to add at the moment?
I was listening to it. Sort of a lot of philosophy I've sometimes come across seems quite sort of complicated. I thought it was interesting comparing sort of philosophy to the natural sciences, but was the sort of morality or morals aspect of it comparable to the genealogy of morality by Nietzsche, the book, or the sort of main points I sort of got from it? But it was an interesting listening to it anyway. Yeah.
Thank you. Right, who wants to go next then? Who's got something else for us?
I'll go next.
Go on then. Let's have Helen. You go next.
Right. Right. Oh God. Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night. What immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? In what distant deeps or skies burnt the fire of thine eyes? On what wings dare he aspire? What the hand dare cease the fire? And what shoulder and what art could twist the sinews of thy heart? And when thy heart begin to beat, what dread hand and what dread feet? What the hammer, what the chain? In what furnace was thy brain? What the anvil, what dead grasp dare its deadly throes clasp? When the stars threw down their spears and watered heaven with their tears, did he smile his work to see? Did he who made the lamb make thee? Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye dare frame thy fearful symmetry?
Can you tell us the source and the author?
I don't know. I've been thinking about the tiger a bit. I like poetry, like about nature, and
Yeah, but who was? Just give us for everyone else. Make sure we all know who it is and when it's from.
oh,
what
sorry,
that
it's
is.
William. It's William Blake.
Yeah.
He's a I think he's a romantic.
Yeah, I think so. Anyone else on William Blake? I think he's a romantic, isn't he? We class him as a romantic. Anyone have any comments or questions for Helen on that text? Anyone heard that one before?
I also chose from William Blake, actually. That's a pure coincidence, but I've got an alternative plan that I can. But yeah, I really like that poem.
You really like? You've got William Blake as well.
I chose William Blake or Shakespeare, one of the two. So
okay, let's go with some more William Blake. That sounds interesting. That sounds like a nice coincidence. Have you got your William Blake there to hand?
Okay, well, yeah, I've got. It's a poem that I wasn't that familiar with. I folded down the pages of Jerusalem, which is really long, and I'm not that familiar with. I can read out either a bit of Midsummer Night's Dream or a poem to Autumn by William Blake.
Whichever you fancy, James. Let's try the Blake, I would say.
Okay, I'll read this part. I'm not that familiar with it, but I thought it sounded quite interesting. So
yeah.
O autumn, laden with fruit and stained with the blood of the grape, pass not but sit beneath my shady roof. There thou mayst rest and tune thy jolly voice to my fresh pipe, and all the daughters of the year shall dance. Sing now the lusty song of fruits and flowers. The narrow bud opens her beauties to the sun. Love runs in her thrilling veins. Blossoms hang around the brows of morning and flourish down the bright cheek of modest eve, till clustering summer breaks forth into singing, and feathered clouds strew flowers round her head. The spirits of the air live on the smells of fruit and joy, with pinions like rose round the gardens, or sit singing in the trees. Thus sang the jolly autumn as he sat, then rose, girded himself, and o'er the bleak hills fled from our sight, but left his golden load. I'm not that familiar with the poem, but I really do like William Blake as well, so I thought I'd go with something I wasn't so familiar with, really. But
oh, good. So, any thoughts, William Blake? It's interesting that Blake's came in. I think that's quite kind of curious. Any thoughts on this? Any questions? Any thoughts?
Yeah, can I ask one? Which was just, I suppose the question I would ask was, what spoke to you? Why? Maybe Helen could go first. Like, what is about that poem that like really spoke to you? Yeah, I'd be interested to know, definitely, and James as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I've been thinking about it all week, and I think I read somewhere that it, like, I don't know where I read it, but somehow like that the tiger has a soul, and that you don't really see the animal. You don't really see the animal. Doesn't really see what you see is just a soul, basically. And so I've been thinking about that, and I've been thinking about why we can't really share nature. Like, it's really strange when I walk outside; it feels like I can't really share it. like people go on holiday to go and experience nice sun or something like that, and just seems a bit exclusive. And I find it very difficult to go outside with this feeling that I'm not really being able to share in nature with people. And I don't know, yeah. So I've been thinking about the tiger a lot, and yeah, that's about it really. So.
For me, the tiger poem's interesting because he doesn't spell tiger with an I, does he? He spells it with a Y. And that could be because it's a kind of illustrated poem. So it just, like, visually, it looks better than with an I. There's some sort of other balance there. But also, I was always troubled by those chains because there were stars and there was all this kind of beautiful thing about it. There was two things about that poem that have always troubled me. One of them is it's in a forest, and a forest feels really English and Jerusalem-y and that sort of thing. And the other thing that's always troubled me about that poem are those metal chains, which feel, I don't know, is he saying something about imperialism? Are the dark satanic mills somehow in Tiger? You know, I'm like...
I just want to quickly say something, sorry, that when I was kind of talking about nature and sharing nature, and when he talks about fearful symmetry, to me it's like it's that outline of a human being, and it seems like a human being, when you look at them, is like completely blocking all of nature, all of space. It just takes it all up, and it's like, what is this fearful symmetry? What is it when I look at a human? Am I faced with this kind of, you know, this kind of, yeah, I don't know what it is. Sorry, I just wanted to explain that.
The phrase fearful symmetry was a kind of, there's certain phrases that occur in texts. And if you were to look up the phrase fearful symmetry, you'll find that it kind of has, it's like a meme. They become like, you know, when like we have folk knowledge or proverbs, it's not quite, it hasn't crystallized into a proverb. Anyone got a good proverb that they can give me an example of? I can't think of a good proverb at the moment. A bird in the hat. What's the one about? See, even then, I'm just trying to think of the one about a bird in a hand and a bush, and I can't remember that. But you all know what a proverb. Anyone got a good proverb?
Bird in the hand's worth more than the bush.
Bird in the hand is worth two in the bush.
Right, there we go. Proverbs. That's how we find these folk knowledges. They're there. We just have to, we dig them out, and we're sitting around the fire, and you dig out these folk knowledges, and they're kind of like little formulas that are part of a cultural structure. And then underneath the little formulas, underneath the proverbs, there's another kind of element of our language that is, it's still a crystallization, but it's not a piece of knowledge. It's a kind of phrase, or it's a character, or it's a name, or it's a slight description, or it's a conjunction. So, Morrigan, you mentioned the mills. So what the dark satanic mills. Yeah, this is another one of those kind of moments of like, you know, that it's not a proverb, but it's got it's like one step below a proverb in terms of like, if you're thinking of like, it's not quite an assemblage of different elements, but it's an element that can be assembled. You know, it's enough of an element that can be reassembled into different ways. And for example, you know, Helen, if you were to think about writing something, you could begin by just working on the notion of fearful symmetry. What is a fearful symmetry? Explore just that phrase, and immediately.
Yeah, but I don't think it's a representation, like a metaphor or something like that. To me, when I read it, I visualize it. I see it as an image, and the problem I have with is this kind of detachment from language and image together. It's like when I'm listening and when I'm seeing, they're not together for some reason. For me, they are, but wherever I look, it's like the focus is somewhere else. And so when I get into poetry, I like it because I can visualize and listen at the same time. It's like a complete happening.
And I think if we were to, so my suggestion, and other people can disagree, is when we're beginning to think about developing our own agency in relationship to our thinking and our writing, it's acceptable, or it's perfectly okay to pick up. Nietzsche had this idea about, you can fire an arrow and other people can pick it up and then fire it on some more. And this was a kind of way of thinking about philosophical thought. You can fire out these arrows and someone else can pick them up and move them along a bit further. And I think there's something interesting in that can be used. So as I say, if when we look at texts that we love or that interest us, it's perfectly okay to not feel like you're doing anything wrong by grabbing hold of a phrase and then just using that as your stepping off point. You know what I mean? Anyone else with some texts or any other comments on some of the poetry and the various different bits and pieces? Any other thoughts on that, or should we move to another text? Any thoughts on that, John, Morrigan, Rob? Any other thoughts? No, John. Okay.
I was just thinking of, I like the phrase "little formulas." That's exactly what I think poetry is supposed to do, isn't it? Produce little formulas for you. And if you pick up on it and relate to it, it means that it's somehow part of your society, isn't it? Or your aspirational aspect that is missing from your society. I think that's when it calls to you, isn't it?
James's piece was interesting. I must admit, I don't think I've heard that before.
I haven't either.
No, right.
I think I prefer Tiger. The other one I was looking for was Where the Old Thames Does Flow. That I don't think it's Jerusalem. That's another quite a famous one, but I couldn't find that. So,
I mean, the one that you read out, it was like for me hearing it, that was like a pre-Raphaelite painting. It was very kind of like lush and ripe.
It was, wasn't it? Yeah, I thought that too. I really like William Blake. Yeah.
So, a philosophical question: what is it? What is happening, or what do we feel? What's going on when we like a text? What is it that we? Is it the fact that we've heard a little formula that we can then take away? Is there something else there? I mean, you mentioned lushness just now in regard to that piece of Blake that James wrote. Is it something to do with the kind of feeling around the text? Is that primarily what makes us like a text?
I think for me, it's about learning to love myself, like on the inside. So when I read a text, it's kind of private, and I can develop my own emotion towards my relationship to something that I want to have a relationship with, rather than the fucking world sometimes.
Fair enough. Anyone else? John, what is it that happens when you think, I like this text? What do you think is going on?
Well, I said to me, it was instant. In the finding of Billy Bragg was instant for me. As I explained, I went to a boarding school for mainly forces children, so we weren't rich or anything. But in my time, 1979, 80, 81, 82, it was primarily all we listened to was heavy metal. Now, I'd be in the front row of an AC/DC concert still, but one day I was walking past a sixth form's room, and they played Billy Bragg, and my world just changed that day. And because I heard something out of key, not really sung very well, but the lyrics just meant, I was a middle class officer's son in a boarding school. I had nothing to do with the front line of a picket line on the coal mine, the coal dispute or anything like that. But just the little formulas he was singing about just changed me instantly, and then I became interested to listen to more and then understand what those little formulas were.
Anyone else? What happens when we like a text? Speak from your own experience. Gather some data so that we can analyze. But we have to have data first. Our experience. Morrigan, what happens when you like a text?
I don't know whether you're like shitting us now, going, we have to gather data first. I feel like you're being very mischievous there.
I'm not being mischievous. I'm talking about like let's first of all respond to ourselves and then look at our responses.
I actually think John's right. I think John's right, but I think there's, you know, like isn't one thing, is it? Like's not like you can't just go, well, like is this formula here. It's not formulaic, but there's certain things that happen when you I'll read mine in a bit. Well, like you kind of know something.
The dopamine rush that I got,
that you didn't know before. You know, you're a different person. And sometimes you have to read things over and over again to kind of remember who you were, who you are, and who you kind of can be, or something like that. I mean, I don't know. I have a really visceral response to some texts, but yeah.
You mentioned dopamine here. You would sort of dopamine there, John. So there's transformation. There's
Definitely.
a kind of response.
I mean, I risked physical punishment for listening to that music, and literally got beaten up for liking faggot music and things like that. And it didn't stop me, because the first thing I did when I got home on my holiday was find some money and go and buy, you know, the play Taxman for the Poetry and things like that album, because obviously the radio, there's no Spotify, you couldn't hear it unless you bought it. I was so desperate for to hear it because I wanted to get that level of dopamine hit that I got the first time.
Joy, should we call it joy? You wanted dopamine hit, neuroscientific language. But that's cool. But yeah, but joy, you felt a kind of joy there, or a kind of
and I instantly go back to it. Now, if I hear it somewhere, walking down the street and I hear it somewhere, I have a massive smile on my face, because it instantly takes me back to that first time I heard it. So yes, it's definitely goes straight. It's a very strong connection in my brain. That.
Right. So what I mean, I'm hearing from both you and Morrigan and Helen here this sort of sense of transformation, these kind of moments of transformative relationships that happen in these sort of sense. I think I want to continue with some of the text. So Morrigan, you mentioned you have a text. Why don't you go next and have a read? Tell us what it is and where it's from.
Well, firstly, I don't like reading out loud because I'm dyslexic. So yeah. This is D.H. Lawrence. It's from The Rainbow. It's a bit long, though. Her soul was carried forward to the altar, to the threshold of eternity, in reverence and fear and joy, but ever she hung back in transit, mistrusting the culmination of the altar. She was not to be flung forward on the lift and the lift of passionate flights, to be cast at last upon the altar steps as upon the shore of the unknown. There was a great joy and a verity in it, but even in the dazed swoon of the cathedral, she claimed another right. The altar was barren, its lights gone out. God burned no more in that bush. It was dead matter lying there. She claimed the right to freedom above her, higher than the roof. She had always a sense of being roofed in. So that she caught at little things which saved her from being swept forward headlong into the tide of passion that leaps onto the infinite in great mass, triumphant and flinging its own course. She wanted to get out of this fixed, leaping forward travelling movement, to rise from it as a bird rises with wet, limp feet from the sea, to lift herself as a bird lifts its breast and thrusts its body from the pulse and heave of a sea that bears it forward to an unwilling conclusion, tear herself away like a bird on wings, and in the open space where there is clarity, rise up above the fixed, surcharged motion, a separate speck that hangs suspended, move this way and that, seeing and answering before it sinks again, having chosen or found the direction in which it shall be carried forward. and it was as if she must grasp at something, as if her wings were too weak to lift her straight off the heaving motion. So she caught sight of the wicked, odd little faces carved in stone, and she stood before them arrested. These sly little faces peeped out of the grand tide of the cathedral like something that knew better. They knew quite well, these little imps that retorted on man's own illusion, that the cathedral was not absolute. They winked and leered, giving suggestion of the many things that had been left out of the great concept of the church. However much there is inside here, there's a good deal they haven't got in, the little faces mocked. Apart from the lift and spring of the great impulse towards the altar, these little faces had separate wills, separate motions, separate knowledge, which rippled back in defiance of the tide and laughed in triumph at their own very littleness. "Oh, look," cried Anna. "Oh, look how adorable the face is. Look at her." Brangwen looked unwillingly. This was the voice of the serpent in his Eden. She pointed him to a plump, sly, malicious little face carved in stone. "He knew her, the man who carved her," said Anna. "I'm sure she was his wife." "It isn't a woman at all, it's a man," said Brangwen curtly. "Do you think so?" "No, that isn't a man. That's no man's face." Her voice sounded jeering. He laughed shortly and went on, but she would not go forward with him. She loitered about the carvings, and he could not go forward without her. He waited impatiently of this counteraction. She was spoiling his passionate intercourse with the cathedral. His brows began to gather. "Oh, this is good," she cried again. "Here is the same woman. Look, only he's made her cross. Isn't it lovely? Hasn't he made her hideous to a degree?" She laughed with pleasure. Didn't he hate her? He must have been a very nice man. "Look at her. Isn't it awfully good? Just like a shrewish woman. He must have enjoyed putting her in like that. He got his own back on her, didn't he?" "It's a man's face. No woman's at all. A monk's, clean shaven," Brangwen said. She laughed with a poof of laughter. "You hate to think he put his wife in your cathedral, don't you?" she mocked, with a tinkle of profane laughter. And she laughed with malicious triumph. She had got free from the cathedral. She had even destroyed the passion he had. She was glad. He was bitterly angry. Strive as he would, he could not keep the cathedral wonderful to him. He was disillusioned. That which had been his absolute, containing all heaven and earth, was become to him, as to her, a shapely heap of dead matter. But dead, dead, dead. His mouth was full of ash. His soul was furious. He hated her for having destroyed the anchor of his vital illusions. Soon he would be stark, without one place wherein to stand, without one belief in which to rest. And yet somewhere in him he responded more deeply to the sly little face that knew better than he had done before to the perfect surge of the cathedral. Nevertheless, for the time being, his soul was wretched and homeless. I don't really know why I like that so much.
What matter was she referring to when she said she was full of dead matter? What matter was that?
She's in a cathedral. She's referring to God, I presume. I don't know. She's referring to the super religiosity of, I was brought up a very strict Catholic. So yeah, she was referring to the super religiosity, the kind of smothering religiosity of inside a church. And he's her husband. And they are completely different. But they share love, but no common understanding of the world around them.
So what do you think she means by dead as well? I mean, is it a kind of feeling she has about leaving the church, or what do you think?
what do I think she means by dead? I think for her, everything is lively, everything is alive, and yet the inside of cathedrals are kind of somehow these deadening spaces, you know, where the stone absorbs all warmth or cold, where everything is kind of just flattened in this strange way because it has no relationship to the, you know, if you look at carvings in a church, you don't go, oh, look at that gargoyle, I wonder who that was it the woman down the road that he really didn't like and he carved her into a gargoyle? You know, it's all so fixed in a cathedral. And for her name's Anna Victrix, and for her it feels dead, because her cathedral is nature, her cathedral is outside, her cathedral is always going to be the life that she can see. Whereas for Will Brangwyn, his church is always going to be the everlasting, which is, you know, a bloody big cathedral. And so they just are at cross purposes here, but also completely on the same page. So it's really odd little piece.
Is it something to do with the introduction of irreverence into a space of reverence? Do you think that kind of, it's again, maybe is it to do with that kind of clash of different conceptual schemes? You know, that phrase I used today, different worldviews, different frames, different sets of glasses that we see through. And so suddenly he sees the cathedral through a different set of glasses, a different conceptual scheme.
I think it's about creative space. I think that he kind of maybe tries to turn her into a gargoyle, if I got that correctly, because he kind of wants her to be a temple herself, you know, to be the create, to have that space inside of her that what he has inside the church. Maybe.
Yeah, I think you're right, because it's part of Lawrence's total preoccupation with the sacred and the profane. You know, what makes something sacred, what makes something profane. And she is both.
Interesting. Yes, and I think the sacred profane is a kind of good thing to think about here, because one of the things that is underlying in some sense our relationships to text, phrases, words that we love, we like, that relate to us is in some, I mean, no one here, I imagine, has brought some profane writing, some journalism from today, or some, you know, everyone would have naturally, I mean, maybe this is an assumption again, but I'm going to assume that everyone is kind of veered towards something that they might feel comfortable saying has a kind of, even in a limited way, sacredness, rather than, you know, just being profanity. I mean, maybe the Billy Bragg is different. We'll see. John, would you like to read your Billy? Is it you've brought Billy Bragg? I take it. You brought the Billy Bragg text, and then we'll come to Rob. Yes.
Yeah, I did bring Billy Bragg. I didn't bring the Milkman of Human Kindness because there's not a lot of lyrics in that. That's more about the song. So I've chose a song that has a lyrical story to it. So but
great. And so, just again, tell us who it is and what it is.
Right. So this is written by Billy Bragg, and it's a release. It was a single release from the Workers' Playtime album in August 22nd, 1988. And it was written after the disillusionment of the 1987 general election, which Bragg described as the Great Leap Forwards, as his way of looking at ambiguities of being a pop star in politics. He basically was in a festival and there was hardly anybody there, and a journalist came up to him afterwards saying, you know, what's the point of being a political songwriter? Nobody's interested. And it's that thought process in his mind that produced this song, and it's amazing to me. And with the actual music accompaniment, it's even better. But so the first two verses mention Camelot for John F. Kennedy and his administration, and about the revolution in Cuba. And the second sort of set of verses is to do with Billy Bragg thinking about where he's going with his musical career. And the sort of the last part of it is about regenerating himself, re-energizing himself, and saying, let's look for the great leap forward. It will come soon. It may not be now, but look for it now. So I'll read it to you. It may have been Camelot for Jack and Jacqueline, but on the Che Guevara highway filling up with gasoline, Fidel Castro's brother spies a rich lady who's crying over luxury's disappointment. So he walks over and he's trying to sympathize with her, but he thinks he should warn her that the third world is just around the corner. In the Soviet Union, a scientist is blinded by the resumption of nuclear testing, and he's reminded that Dr. Oppenheimer's optimism fell at the first hurdle. In the Cheese Pavilion, the only noise I hear is the sound of someone stacking chairs and mopping up spilt beer, and someone asking questions and basking in the light of 15 fame-filled minutes of the fanzine writer. Mixing pop and politics, he asks me what is the use. I offer him embarrassment and my usual excuses. While looking down the corridor out to where the van is waiting, I'm looking for the great leap forwards. Jumble sales are organised and pamphlets have been posted. Even after closing time, there are still parties to be hosted. You can be active with the activists or sleep with the sleepers while you're waiting for the great leap forwards. 1 leap forward, 2 leaps back. Will politics get me the sack? Here comes the future, and you can't run from it. If you've got a blacklist, I want to be on it. It's a mighty long way down rock and roll, from top of pops to drawing the dole. If no one seems to understand, start your own revolution and cut out the middleman. In a perfect world, we'll all sing in tune, but this is reality, so give me some room. So join the struggle while you may. The revolution is just a t-shirt away, waiting for the great leap forwards. Yeah.
Can I say something?
Yep.
There is literally no way that you would have known this, John. It's Matt and my wedding anniversary today. We've been married 31 years. On our first date, I went back to Matt's flat and he played me that song. And we proceeded to dance around the lounge, singing along to that song on our first date. And it's our wedding anniversary today.
Well, there we are, you see, in tune.
Exactly. Texts have this remarkable capacity to link all kinds of things together, as does perhaps the sacred. Maybe that's part of our connection. I'm going to move forward because I want to sort of wind up about past, and it's 7 minutes past 9 now. So, Rob, a text from you. Let's have that, and then we'll have our final kind of round of conversations, and we'll see what we're going to do next.
All right then. So I've got a book called Ridley Walker, Russell Hoban, and it's written in like a sort of made up dialect, so it's quite hard to read. So it's set in like the future, kind of like what reminded me of your reading, Matt, from your text, because this is like that there's been a great collapse and language has been sort of kind of corrupted, or it's like the idiom that people speak is we can understand it as the reader, but it takes quite a bit of work to sort of to understand. Like it takes a few chapters to get into it, so I'll give it a go anyway. Okay. She were the oldest in our crowd, but her voice weren't old. It made the rest of her seem young for a little. It were a cold night, but we were warm in that doss bag, listening to the dogs howling afterwards and the wind wuthering and wearying and nattering in the oak leaves. Looking at the moon all cold and white and lonesome, Lorna said to me, "You know, Ridley, there's something in us, it don't have no name." I said, "What thing is that?" She said, "It's some kind of thing. It ain't us, but yet it's in us. It's looking out through our eye holes. Maybe you don't take no notice of it sometimes. Say you get woke up sudden in the middle of the night. One minute you're asleep and the next you're on your feet, with a spear in your hand. Well, it weren't you put that spear in your hand, it were that other thing what's looking out through your eye holes. It ain't you, nor it don't even know your name. It's in us, lorn and lone and sheltering how it can. I said, if it's in every one of us, there's more than one of it. There's got to be the manying, there's got to be the millying and more. Lorna said, well, there is a millying and more. I said, well, if there's such a manying of it, why is it lorn and why is it lone? She said, because the manying and the millying is all one thing. It don't have nothing together with. You look at lichens on a stone, it's all them tiny manyings of it, and maybe each part of it might think it's serpent, only we can see it's all one thing. That's how it is with what we are. It's all one girt big thing and divvied up amongst the many. It's all one girt thing bigger nor the whirl and lone and ownsome. Tremoring it is and feared. It puts us on like we put on our clothes. Sometimes we don't fit. Sometimes it can't find the armholes and it tears us apart. I don't think it took all that much notice of it when I'd been young. Now I'm old, I notice it more. I don't really like to put me on no more. It don't really like to put me on no more. Every morning I can feel how it's tired of me and readying to throw me away. I'll tell you something, Ridley, and keep this in remembrance. Whatever it is, we don't come natural to it. I said, Lorna, I don't know what you mean. She said, we ain't a natural part of it. We didn't begin when it begun. We didn't begin where it begun. It been here before us, nor I don't know what we are to it. Maybe we're just only sickness and a fever to it, or boils on the arse of it. I don't know. Now listen what I'm telling you, Ridley. It thinks us, but it don't think like us. It don't think the way we think. Plus, like I said before, it's a fiat. I said, what's it a fiat of? She said, it's a fiat of being birthed. I said, how can that be? You said it been here before us. If it been here all this time, it must have been birthed sometime. She said, no, it ain't been birthed. It never does get birthed. It's always in the womb of things. It's always on the road. I said, all this what you just been telling, be that a tell for me? She laughed. She said, Ridley, there ain't nothing that ain't a tell for you. The wind in the night, the dust on the road, even the least stone you kick along front of you, even the shadow of that lesser stone rolling on and standing still, it's all a telling. Well, I can't say for certain no more if I had any of them things in my mind before she told me, but ever since then it seems like they've always been there. Seems like I've been always thinking on that thing in us, what thinks us but don't think like us. Our whole life is an idea we didn't think of, nor we don't know what it is. What a way to live. That's why I finally come to writing all this down, thinking on what the idea of us might be, thinking on that thing what's in us and lorn and lone and ownsome.
Thank you, Rob. Any comments or thoughts on that? And yes, I can see the connection to the kind of catastrophe thing there. That's interesting, particularly the fact that the person is using this deliberately idiosyncratic, would it be called an idiom? I think they're using idiomatic language. We've constructed a particular kind of idiom that produces that context. And an idiom is a kind of accent or way in which people talk within a particular cultural context.
What do you think bothered her about this thing, about this kind of this birthing? What do you think what bothered her about it?
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's a sort of that uncanny feeling of realizing there's something below the surface. Like, I'm not sure if it bothered her or whether it was just more of a, like a sort of feeling of this isn't all it seems, or this, I don't know. It reminded me of what we've been talking about with, when we talk about the id or some sort of some sort of unconscious thing that is within us. But I suppose these people don't have access to, I'd imagine, to to Freud or to any of that stuff, so they are discovering it as if for the first time. That's kind of what I felt when I read it.
What was your story of like or love with this text then? Let's say John's was, when he's younger, listening to Billy Bragg in the cloakroom, or not the cloakroom, in the common room. What was your relationship to this particular text? Was it something you read recently or younger, or was it?
I read it quite a bit. I was quite a lot younger, and I think it was just a sort of one of those novels, because I don't actually read that many novels now, but it's one of those novels that was quite challenging and made me reconsider what sort of a novel could do or what it could be, and it just like really lingered with me. And it's a bit like what I think we said the other week. I really loved it so much when I first read it. I couldn't bring myself to read it again in case I sort of didn't feel the same. But I love that bit. It's really like lingered with me just ever since I read it.
I think there's something interesting in the and again, this is to put forward assumptions that can be challenged, but I think there's something interesting in this sense of texts that matter to us, or texts that we encounter. They're not, in a sense, fundamentally descriptions. And one of the problems I have with reading a lot of modern novels is that they read just like a script. They read like they're describing a film that they want the book to be made into, that they're going to sell the rights for as soon as they possibly can. And so what you end up feeling like you're reading is a description of a film you're not watching, and that would actually probably be more enjoyable to watch than to read. And so that it often feels like, well, all you're trying to do is sell a script here. I don't really, and you're just describing stuff. There's not that transformative moment. And I'm kind of interested in this because I think this is both what enables a kind of sense of agency or a sense of writing. If you write something and you feel happy with it or glad about it, it's kind of it's because in a sense you feel like it's got some transformative element in it. But I also feel like that's the block that a lot of us have to writing. It's as though if we don't write something that's transformative and sacred and wonderful, somehow what we're doing is wasted time, wasted effort, wasted words, or whatever. And I think that so it has this kind of double edge of like, that's what we love about a good text, that's what we love about something we read. At the same time, it's that thing that we feel like we can't produce and we have to be passive in relationship to. And I think that's Morrigan, go on.
It's like what Rob just read, and it was interesting when Helen asked me about the piece. It's like knowing without knowing, and most people don't write like that. They think they have to know something before they write it, rather than not, or they think that they have to write something to know something, if you see what I mean. But that the knowing has to be part of knowing is somewhere in the writing, rather than just the writing being some sort of, I think this is what Artaud goes on about. This is what, Nietzsche kind of says, slit a vein, this sort of thing. It's like maybe writing isn't knowing and knowing isn't writing in that sort of sense.
What did in the text, Rob, did the guy speak back to her at all?
Yeah, it was a conversation between those two characters. It was a bit out of context, I know, but Ridley Walker was talking to the lady she's kind of like a shaman figure, and I think he was saying it's the first time he'd considered that idea, and it lingered with him, the Ridley Walker character. I'm not sure if that came across.
I think it sort of came across. And I definitely the idiom could come across, and I think it is. Yes, it reminds me of Anthony Burgess's Clockwork Orange, and the way in which an idiom is developed there. If you've never read that, you might find that interesting, because again, that develops this particular language inside. And one of the things I remember reading Clockwork Orange when I was very young, about 12, 13. One of the things that was interesting about that is, like reading poetry, it interrupts the reading process. You have to kind of slow down and reorganize your reading process, and almost like, you know, one of the things I advocate everyone to do, if you don't do it, it's something you're missing, but is to practice reading things out loud, particularly difficult things, and sometimes philosophy as well, whether not just poetry or interesting novels with idiomatic phrases, is to practice kind of reading them out loud to find how they would be spoken. I want to come back to what Morrigan said about knowing and writing, Dave, because I think that's kind of crucial, and it's one of the things I would like to kind of I would like to suggest that we all are kind of aware of and begin to maybe put aside here if we're going to develop some writing, which I'm going to begin to push a little bit more in the next few weeks. That sense of, like, you know, particularly when it encounters philosophy, particularly when we're working with kind of philosophical texts or trying to sort of semi-work philosophically, that there's that assumption that we have to know what we're doing, we have to know the argument we're making, and what this assumption does is it forgets the process of production. It encounters a text that's already been worked and already been done, and doesn't really, you know, in doing so, it's like looking at a house and trying to work out how it was built. You know, if you look at a house, you can't necessarily work out. You can maybe go and get a big pile of bricks and think, right, they stick together a bit like this, and you could try from the outside to look at a house and rebuild it. But if you didn't actually look at a builder building a house, you're going to be, you know, massively disadvantaged. If you didn't actually maybe engage with the builder and have a bit of apprenticeship in building a wall, your walls are probably going to be very wobbly and very frail, and so it's going to be a bad way of building a house if you just look at a house and then try and build it your own without any of the intermediate phases and all those skills that the builder and the architects and all the other people are using. And I think this is, again, part of what we have to kind of encounter when we're trying to write philosophically, both that relationship to knowing and trying to put it aside a little bit. That may be a part of a goal, but that's not, we don't start from knowing. We're gonna have to sort of worry about that in a little while, so that we can actually just begin to actually engage in that process of writing, because that process of writing itself is a bit like learning to bricklay. You know, it's not something that is a natural talent. It doesn't mean it's necessarily particularly complicated, but it does, like everything else, need engagement with it.
I think that's true. I think that it's important to acknowledge that not knowing is a way of actually discovering a new kind of knowledge, because, you know, if you're kind of you know, going along the lines of knowing all the time, you're not really uncovering the reasons why you're writing in the first place. So you may be just following some sort of train track where it's just kind of leading you somewhere that's kind of a kind of matter, like you talk about, like a kind of dead matter that kind of that you've kind of formalized in order to kind of just get the job done, maybe, like you said, like being alienated in the work itself. So, you know, by giving that kind of like inner track that you talked about, John, earlier today, you know, it's kind of like what John talks about in his questioning of intelligence, like a clearing of consciousness, which is what I felt tonight when you read your stuff, Matt. You know, that kind of space to actually just be, not even actually, you know, putting a word on anything, but actually just allowing for something to formulate that isn't kind of that isn't imposed from, you know, a kind of idea that you have about who you are or what you should be or what anyone else says, kind of thing.
Any other last thoughts on writing and possible ideas and all this sort of stuff before we wind up for the evening? And any thoughts on what you would like to do next? If you don't, that's fine. I have a couple of ideas and I will bring them up on River, and we have a couple of weeks. But any last thoughts? We're going to round up for the evening.
The main problem, of course, is any academic work you do is all about knowledge, and the writing the essays is the proof that you understand the point. You always get marked down if you did that. I mean, I haven't done a philosophy degree. I did mine a bit more psychology, so you always had to base it on somebody else's thought process that they had already had. So it's quite difficult, isn't it, to write in that space unless you are a poet, I imagine. And that's probably what I admire about Billy, that he can take something quite simple and turn it into poetry. It means he's having fresh thoughts. He's not bothered about what other people think. He's just putting his thoughts down. And I think that's quite hard for most of us to do, I imagine.
I agree. I think it's extremely hard for most of us to. Most of us, I don't think, are given any real encounter with how to begin to write, how to begin to think, and let me like caveat that. So when we are taught in universities, what we're empowered with, and I think what some people are empowered with in universities and in schools, is the capacity to participate in a conversation, not to feel like they have to be browbeaten, if you like, or they have to just accept something. They can kind of respond, or they can respond critically, or they can think about how to put things together. But as Helen mentioned, quite often that takes you down sort of train tracks. And so, you know, quite often in university, the train tracks would be, I would see this when students would come with an essay plan, that they were often good students that had done well in A-levels, and they'd come in and they'd have this essay plan that was 2 pages long, and it was all formulaic. And you knew that no matter how well they wrote that essay, basically it was never going to be a first. It was always ever going to be a 2-1. Because there was nothing in it that wasn't essentially outside of the train track. There was no color, there was no life, there was nothing of them in it. They'd learned to do the process. They'd learned to write the report on their knowledge very competently, and in doing so, that they are empowered. They are given a kind of literacy in the world, but they're not given an agency. They're not given any real agency in relationship to their writing. And often, you know, you'd find more interest in the student who was writing chaotically and emotionally, and you would work with those students to try and formulate them a little bit into something that could pass through university education, but they would be more interesting to read, and they would just be more interesting to deal with, because the other person, you could kind of, you know, formulaically go through it, and you could read the formulaic essay in 10 minutes, you know, a 1,500 word essay, read it in 10 minutes, you know what I mean? They'd spent 10 days maybe working on it, and it got 10 minutes reading, whereas the person who'd written emotionally and chaotically, you'd often have to spend an hour, and it would be, you know, just to read and work out what was going on, and you'd engage with it differently like that, and you're like, oh right, okay, maybe. And you know, so I think there's a difference between literacy and agency in relationship to text that we're kind of encountering, and hopefully some of this might be some of the things we're kind of beginning to think about here. I'm going to wind up for the evening unless anyone has any final comments. No, shout now or forever hold your peace, or for at least a couple of weeks hold your peace. So if there's no final comments, and no immediate thoughts about what you want to do next, I will pop some notes up on River about what we can do next. And after that, thank you very much, everybody, for coming along this evening. It's been lovely to see you all. And I will catch you all in a couple of weeks. And in the meantime, maybe, as I say, pop along to the introduction to decolonial political ecology that begins next Monday. This is for anyone watching this. Next Monday, Fub, 6 to 8 p.m. online on Zoom. You can check it out on freeuniversitybrighton.org and sign up there. Do you want to all say goodbye?
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
See you soon.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much for that. We're going to wind up for the evening now. As you can see, what we're doing is we are kind of currently working on this relationship to the production of texts. We'll carry on with that, and we'll carry on perhaps with a little bit of a conversation around Fanon and Skitz analysis a bit more. But at the moment, this term, probably until December, we're going to be working on this kind of idea of our relationship to how we write, what we write, and how our agency is engaged in that. And in particular, to try and engage with this kind of notion of subjectivity, the productions of subjectivity as a relationship to text. So thank you very much, everybody, and thank you for all the participants in the conversation. And I will see you maybe in a week or two at some point. You can follow me on Twitter. You can follow me on Twitch. You can see what's going on if you want. And there's a Discord if you want to ask questions privately and get involved and all that sort of stuff. With that, I will see you out for the evening. And thank you very much. Goodbye.